My brother Dennis has never been good at keeping secrets. He has a tell, a slight compression of his lips, like a man swallowing something he was never supposed to say in the first place. I have known this tell since we were boys, since the summer he ate the last of my mother's strawberry jam and stood in the kitchen doorway with his mouth pressed into that exact shape, trying to look innocent, and failing with a particular completeness that honest people fail with when they try to lie. I noticed the tell at 6:47 in the evening on Christmas Day, when he leaned across the table and put his mouth close to my ear and whispered 4 words that took me approximately 60 seconds to understand, and approximately an hour after that to understand fully, and the rest of the night to understand the way you understand something when the whole of its architecture finally becomes visible to you at once. What I didn't know yet, sitting at that table with the candlelight and the good wine, and 7 people who between them represented most of what I had built over 63 years, was that the thing Dennis was trying to warn me about had been in motion for 11 months, 3 weeks, and 4 days. That the man sitting across from me, cutting his turkey with the methodical precision of someone who had rehearsed even this, had spent those 11 months and 3 weeks and 4 days treating my life like a property in need of acquisition. And that the only reason it had not already gone the way he planned was a piece of luck so specific and arbitrary that when I eventually laid it out for my attorney, he shook his head and said, "Walter, I have been doing this for 22 years, and I still cannot get comfortable with how thin the margin is sometimes." But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit I developed over 31 years of reading water. You learn to see the whole system before you name any individual part of it. You learn that the place a river appears is never the place a river begins. My name is Walter Greer. I am 63 years old. I spent the better part of my working life as a hydrologist for the Millhaven County Water Authority, which means I studied water, how it moved, where it went, what it carried in its current, and what it left behind when the current changed. People think of water as the softest thing in the world. They're not wrong, but they make the mistake of thinking soft means weak, and that's an error with consequences. Water doesn't argue. Water doesn't force. Water simply finds the lowest available point and fills it, and then it finds the next lowest point. And if you give it enough time, and water is in no hurry whatsoever, it will carve through granite. Not because it's strong, because it is absolutely, completely, inexhaustibly patient. I have thought about that a great deal over the past year. I grew up in Millhaven County, one of 2 boys raised by 2 working parents in a house that had good bones and not much else, which is a description that applies to a lot of things I have valued in my life. My father drove a propane delivery truck for 30 years. My mother was a school secretary and later an assistant principal, a small woman with a very clear view of things, who said what she thought and meant it, which is an approach to the world that has more enemies than it deserves. Dennis, 4 years younger than me, went into construction. I went to the State University on an academic scholarship and came out with a hydrology degree and a job offer from the county and a healthy skepticism about anything that moved faster than I could measure it. I retired at 59 after the second surgery on my left knee made 30-mile field surveys more of a liability than an asset. My supervisor at the time, Jim Ballard, was a man of genuine warmth and unremarkable cooking, who threw me a small party in the break room. There was a sheet cake shaped like a river basin, which I thought was either very thoughtful or very funny, depending on the angle. Jim made a speech that was 2 minutes longer than it needed to be. Linda from accounting cried, which surprised me and probably surprised her. I shook a lot of hands, collected a generous card, and drove home in my 2004 Silverado, which at the time had 187,000 miles on it, and a crack in the passenger side mirror that I had been meaning to address since the winter of 2018. My daughter Renee had been after me for 2 years to buy something newer, "Dad, that truck is embarrassing," she said, which was a word that had never applied to a vehicle in my mind, and still doesn't. What I knew about the Silverado was that I knew every sound it made and what each sound meant. I could tell by the pitch of the engine whether it was running lean or rich, whether the front left tire needed 20 pounds or 22. Knowledge of a system is its own kind of value, and I've always been reluctant to exchange it for something shiny that I'd have to learn all over again from scratch. I live in the house I built in 1991 with Dennis and a man named Carl Presley, who is now a civil engineer in Baton Rouge and sends me a Christmas card every year without fail, always with a handwritten note about whatever he's been working on, and who remains the most competent concrete finisher I have ever watched work. It's a 4-bedroom ranch house on the eastern edge of Millhaven County, which is not a fashionable address, but sits on 11 acres of watershed land. A mix of mature timber, creek bottom, and the upper basin of the county's primary drainage system that the county had attempted to purchase from me in 2009, 2014, and 2020 at increasingly generous prices, and which I had declined each time without particular drama. The property is worth considerably more than a 4-bedroom ranch house in Millhaven County would suggest. I had not thought about this fact in any active way for several years. It simply existed, the way the property itself existed. Solid, stable, part of the landscape I moved through without much examination. My wife, Patricia, died in the spring of 2017. We were married for 34 years. She was the kind of woman who read 3 books simultaneously and argued with the radio and could produce a cornbread that I have not managed to replicate in the 6 years since she has been gone, despite following the recipe she wrote out for me in the hospital, in that careful, precise handwriting of hers that always looked like it belonged in a different century. After she died, I lived alone in the house for a year and a half, in the particular way that a person lives alone in a place that was built for more people than currently occupy it. The rooms were the same size. The furniture was in the same places. The sounds were different in ways that I was aware of, but did not speak about to anyone. Renee came home from Atlanta to check on me in the fall of 2018. She stayed 2 months. She reorganized my kitchen, which I didn't need, and made me go to the doctor, which I did need. She was 33 at the time, sharp and practical, and occasionally exasperated with me in the specific way that daughters who love their fathers become exasperated with them, which I have always found more reassuring than not. When she went back to Atlanta, she left me with a set of containers for the freezer and a list of restaurants that delivered, and I used neither of them, but appreciated the gesture. Then she met Marcus Caldwell. I want to give Marcus Caldwell a fair description, because he deserves accuracy, even if he doesn't deserve much else. He was 41 years old when Renee introduced us. A well-made man, physically, with the kind of face that people describe as trustworthy without being able to say exactly why, which is usually a function of symmetry and the specific quality of someone's attention when they're looking at you. He had dark hair going gray at the temples, in a way that he had clearly decided was distinguished rather than inconvenient. He was well-dressed, in the way that suggests the clothes were chosen carefully, but not expensively, which is a distinction that matters. The people who spend the most on their clothing are often advertising a status they're not sure they have, while the people who are certain of their status tend to dress for comfort. Marcus dressed in a manner that communicated competence and accessibility simultaneously, which was, I came to understand, a very deliberate calculation. He had a background in what he called real estate investment and asset repositioning, which meant, and here I am giving you the accurate version rather than the version he gave people at dinner parties, buying distressed or undervalued properties, often from families in financial or legal difficulty, and reselling them after minimal improvement for substantial profit. There is nothing inherently wrong with this. What was wrong And what I did not yet know when Renee first brought him to my house for Sunday dinner was the specific mechanism by which he identified and evaluated his targets. He treated Renee well. I want to be absolutely clear about this, because it is part of the picture and it would be a distortion to leave it out. In the 18 months they were together before that Christmas, I never witnessed anything that raised an alarm in the direct way. No raised voice, no contempt, no pattern of control that announced itself as such. What I saw was subtler, and it was subtler in the way that competent fraud is always subtler than obvious fraud. He finished her sentences occasionally, and when he did, he finished them correctly, which is more insidious than finishing them wrong, because correctness looks like intimacy. He expressed opinions about her friends that were framed as concern, which is a way of expressing opinions about people without owning the opinions. He had, over the course of their relationship, positioned himself gradually as the primary interpreter of information in her life, the one who explained things, who contextualized things, who made things make sense. I recognize this pattern the way you recognize the early signs of a diverted drainage channel. It looks like good management of the flow until you trace where the water is actually going. I said nothing to Renee. She was 35 years old, and she was not a child. And I am not a man who confuses his own perception with his daughter's right to her own life. What I had was a feeling. Specifically, the kind of cold and undramatic unease that arrives not as alarm bells, but as a persistent, low-frequency wrong miss. Like an engine note that's slightly off from where it should be. I noted it. I filed it. I waited. They got engaged in September. Renee called me from the restaurant. She and Marcus and 3 of her friends. A celebration, she said, had come as a surprise, which I took note of. A public engagement in front of an audience where the answer becomes a performance before it becomes a decision. She was happy. I could hear it clearly. I said all the right things and meant most of them. Marcus called me the following Sunday and asked to have lunch, man to man, to talk about the future. He said it with a particular emphasis that suggested the word had more content than 4 letters usually carry. We ate at a place near his office in the newer part of downtown Millhaven, a restaurant that had the specific aesthetic of a place that wanted you to feel you were spending money wisely on food that was actually expensive, which is a different proposition than good food. He paid. He had chosen the restaurant. He also ordered for both of us when the server came. Not in the aggressive way that makes a woman uncomfortable, but in the smooth and generous way that presents itself as a favor. "I've had everything here. Let me take care of this." I let it pass. He talked about his plans with a fluency and speed that I recognized as the rhetoric of a man who has given this speech before and refined it through iteration. He said he wanted me to know that he was serious about Renee and serious about family. He said he understood the weight of what he was stepping into, and here he mentioned Patricia by name, briefly and with what appeared to be genuine delicacy, which I noted as a competent move. He talked about financial stability and long-term thinking and building something that would last. When the check came, he slid his card across the table without breaking eye contact with me, which is the move of a man who wants you to know he can pay, and also that he doesn't need to make a production of being able to pay. I noted this too. Then he looked at me and said, "Walter, I want you to know that I understand what this property means to your family. I want to make sure Renee's future is protected the way it should be." I thanked him. I shook his hand. I drove home. I thought about that sentence for a long time. Not about what it said, which was reasonable enough on the surface, about what it had said in the order it said it. Property first, then future. As though he had drawn the map in his head and then described the destination in reverse. As though the destination was the property and the route was Renee. I said nothing. I had nothing concrete to say, and I am not a man who says things without concrete support. I noted it, the way you note a change in the color of a water sample. An indicator, possibly. Possibly nothing. You take the sample. You wait for the results. The Christmas dinner was at my house, as it had been every year since Patricia died. We were 7 at the table. Me and Renee and Marcus, Dennis and his wife Carol, who is a small, organized woman with a dry sense of humor and the most thorough memory for detail of anyone I have ever met, a quality that will become relevant shortly. My sister Loretta, who is 4 years younger than Dennis and twice as loud, in the way that some people are loud because the world hasn't given them enough reason to be quiet. And Marcus's mother, Sylvia Caldwell, who had driven up from Birmingham specifically for the occasion, and who was a compact, precise woman in her late 60s with excellent posture and opinions about the proper seasoning of gravy that she expressed diplomatically but clearly. I had started cooking at 9 in the morning. The turkey went in at 10. I made Patricia's cornbread from the recipe she'd written out, which I've been making every Christmas since she died, and which still comes out slightly different from hers, in a way I cannot identify, because there's something in a person's hands that doesn't transfer to paper. By 3 in the afternoon, the house smelled the way it was supposed to smell on this particular day, and I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes with a glass of water and let myself feel something close to ordinary. Patricia used to stand in the same kitchen with her hands in the pockets of her apron and run the whole operation from memory, producing a meal that arrived at the table in perfect sequence, from a kitchen that looked like a hurricane had briefly visited it. I still set her coffee cup on the counter when I cook. I didn't plan to start doing this. I don't plan to stop. Dinner was at 6. The table conversation was the kind that happens when 7 people share varying degrees of comfort and familiarity. Easy and even affectionate in some patches, slightly formal in others. Carried primarily by Loretta, who has never encountered a silence she didn't feel personally responsible for filling. Sylvia and Loretta got along well, which I had half expected. They were similar women in different registers, both precise about the things that mattered to them and generous about the things that didn't. Dennis ate steadily and said little, which was his mode of engagement with most social occasions. Carol listened and watched, which was hers. Marcus was excellent. That's the most accurate word. He was funny and attentive, and drew Sylvia into conversations with a skill that I watched with the same detached appreciation I might give to a well-engineered bridge, acknowledging the craftsmanship without letting it obscure the question of what it was built to carry. He kept Renee's glass full and laughed at the right moments, and asked Dennis about his construction work with apparent interest. He told a story about a property deal in Nashville that was self-deprecating in just the right measure, making himself look like a man who was good enough at his work to afford to laugh at his own mistakes. Renee was happy. I could see it without difficulty, the way you can see whether a watercourse is running freely or under strain. She leaned toward Marcus when she laughed. She touched his arm when she spoke. She looked across the table at me twice during the meal, with an expression that I recognized as the particular happiness of a person who wants the people they love to see what they see. I smiled back. I meant it. It was at 6:47, between the second and third pass of the wine. I had been watching the light change through the dining room window, because I have always found changing light easier to look at than some things. That Dennis set down his fork very quietly, shifted in his chair, and leaned sideways toward me. He did not lean far. He did not move in any way that announced itself to the rest of the table. He brought his mouth to within a few inches of my ear, and he said, quietly, "Walt, look at your account." Then he leaned back and picked up his fork and cut a piece of turkey and chewed it, looking at his plate. I looked at him for 1 second. His face was composed, neutral in the way you have to work to be neutral when you're carrying something. His lips were slightly compressed. I had seen that compression since he was 9 years old. "Could you pass the rolls?" Sylvia said, to no one in particular. I passed the rolls. I smiled at Sylvia. I said I thought I'd left my phone in the kitchen and would be back in a moment. I went to the kitchen and picked up my phone from the counter and looked at the screen. I had a savings account that I had maintained since 1988. It had begun as a house fund, became a renovation fund when Renee was small, became the account from which we'd managed Patricia's medical costs during the last year of her illness, and had afterward become, simply, the thing I added to every month because the habit of adding to it had outlasted every purpose it had served. It held, at the time of that Christmas dinner, a balance that I am not going to state in precise terms, but which was the accumulated result of 31 years of regular deposits, compound interest, and the proceeds from 2 investment properties I had sold in 2019 after holding them for 12 years. It was not a small balance. There was a pending wire transfer, initiated 3 days prior, on December 22nd, a Wednesday, for $62,000, payable to an account at a financial institution I did not recognize, with a routing number that would lead, as I discovered later, to a holding company incorporated in the state of Delaware 18 months before that Christmas. The authorization had been processed through my online banking portal. The login credentials were mine. The device was listed as a tablet. I have never owned a tablet. I stood in the kitchen with the turkey on the counter and the sounds of dinner coming through the door and my hand holding the phone. I put my other hand flat on the countertop. Patricia's granite, dark, with a vein of gold running through it like a river on a topographic map, which she had chosen in 2002 after looking at samples for 3 weeks and was never for one moment uncertain about. The surface was very cold. I looked at the wire transfer. $62,000. A device I didn't own. 3 days ago. Pending. Not completed. Still movable. I set the phone face down on the counter. I stood there for a moment. Through the kitchen door, I could hear Loretta saying something about a neighbor's dog, and Carol laughing, and Marcus saying something in the lower register that he used when he wanted to sound like the reasonable person in the room. I heard Renee laugh at something. It was her real laugh. The full one, not the social one. I have known the difference since she was 4 years old. I thought, $62,000. I thought, a device I don't own. I thought, he said property first. Then I picked up the cranberry sauce from the refrigerator, where I had put it earlier, and I carried it back to the table and set it down, and sat down and smiled at Sylvia, who was telling Loretta about a garden she'd started in her backyard. The water was moving, but I didn't have the map yet. There was no reason to move without the map. The guests left between 9 and 10. Sylvia first. She had a long drive, and she had been gracious about it, pressing my hand at the door and saying it had been a beautiful evening, which she said with the sincerity of a woman who does not say things she doesn't mean. Then Loretta, who hugged everyone twice and left a lipstick mark on Dennis's cheek that Carol pointed out immediately. Dennis and Carol last, among the guests. Dennis found me in the kitchen as I was covering the leftover turkey. He came in and stood next to me without saying anything for a moment. Then he said, quietly, "Did you look?" "I looked," I said. He exhaled. "Carol found something. I'll call you tonight." "I know," I said. He looked at me for a moment. He has my father's eyes, brown, slightly far set, the kind that look calm even when they're not. "You okay?" "I'm fine," I said. "Go home." Marcus and Renee were the last to leave. Renee hugged me at the door, the way she had since she was small, with her head turned sideways against my shoulder, and her arms very tight around me, the way a child holds on when they're not entirely sure everything is fine, but don't have the words for what's wrong. I held her and thought about the word pending, which is a very specific word. It means something has been requested, but not yet completed. There is still a window. The size of the window depends on how fast you move. Marcus shook my hand. He held it slightly longer than a standard handshake, and he looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as warm. Full and direct and warm. The eyes of a man who has nothing to conceal, or a perfect simulation of the eyes of a man who has nothing to conceal, which is, in practical terms, the same thing. He said it had been a wonderful evening. He said the cornbread was the best he'd ever had, which was a compliment I received and set aside. He said he was grateful to be part of the family. He said this last thing looking directly at me, and it was the most convincing thing he said all night. I said thank you. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway in the quiet and listened to the sound of his car backing out of the drive. Then I went to the kitchen, poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon that I had been saving for no reason I could have named at the time, sat at the table where Patricia and I had sat for 34 years of evenings, and called Dennis. He picked up before the second ring, which meant he'd been holding the phone. "Tell me all of it," I said. He told me. Carol had been doing genealogy research, a project she had taken up in retirement with the methodical enthusiasm she brings to everything. Building out the family record with the care of an archaeologist reconstructing a civilization from fragments. She had been using the county property records as a cross-reference because land transfers often document family relationships more reliably than birth records in that era. She had been searching a range of parcel numbers adjacent to mine when she found, filed 6 weeks prior, an application for a commercial easement on the watershed section of my property. The application used my name. It used my parcel number. The legal representative listed was an attorney she could not find any record of in the State Bar database. The contact address was a post office box in Franklin County. The fee schedule was structured, and here Carol had shown it to her friend who was an estate attorney, and the estate attorney had said this very carefully, in a way that would route the proceeds to a private account held by an LLC. "Do you know the name of the LLC?" I said. "Watershed Holdings South," Dennis said, which I realize sounds, "Show me tomorrow," I said. "Send me whatever Carol has tonight, and show me the rest tomorrow." "Walt," he said, "it's Marcus." "I know," I said. Dennis was quiet for a moment. I could hear Carol in the background, the sound of a television being turned down. "How much do you know?" he said. "The wire transfer is $62,000, I said. "Pending. 3 days old. Authorized from a device I don't own using my credentials." Dennis made a sound that wasn't a word. "Don't say anything to anyone," I said. "I'll call you tomorrow. Tell Carol I'm grateful. She didn't have to look into it." "She didn't know what she was looking into," Dennis said. "She found it looking for something else. She almost didn't say anything because she thought she'd made an error." "Tell her she didn't make an error," I said. I hung up. I sat at the table with the bourbon and my laptop, and I pulled up everything I could find. The LLC. The property application, which Dennis forwarded to me in the next 20 minutes, with Carol's notes attached. The county assessor's database, which showed the filing date and the case number, and the reference to the legal representative, whose name, Arthur Finch, attorney at law, produced, when I searched it, an office address in a Nashville suburb, a website that had been registered 14 months ago, and no other verifiable record. I found 2 other easement applications in 2 other counties that used the same LLC and a different representative. I found a third in a county 2 hours east, filed 8 months prior, and still under review. I opened a notepad and began writing down the timeline. December 22nd, wire initiated. November, the county application filed. October, a document I had found referenced in the LLC's operating agreement. obtained through the State Business Records database, showed the LLC had entered an agreement with a consulting firm. September. Marcus and Renee's engagement. March. The first LLC was formed. March. I sat with that for a moment. 9 months before Christmas. 2 months after he had first had dinner in my house. Approximately 6 weeks after Renee had first mentioned his name to me in any serious way. I thought about the lunch, about property first and future second. I thought about water, about how long before you can see the canyon has already started. I closed the laptop at 2 in the morning. I washed the bourbon glass. I went and stood in the dining room in the dark, at the table where we had all just been, which still held the rings from the glasses and the warmth from the evening. There were drips of candle wax on the cloth. Sylvia's earring, small and silver, on the edge of the table where she'd set it down. I picked up the earring and placed it on the sideboard. Then I went to bed. Not because the weight had lifted, it hadn't, but because a man who burns his energy on the wrong side of the problem has nothing left when the right moment comes. I have known this since I was 24 years old and stood at the edge of a flooding creek with every instinct telling me to move and the data telling me to wait. And I waited. And the creek crested 2 feet lower than it would have if I'd intervened. I lay in the dark for a while. I thought about Renee. I thought about how she had looked at me across the dinner table with that expression, wanting me to see what she saw. I thought about how she had been at the airport in 2017 when I picked her up after Patricia's funeral, when she was 32 years old and looked for a moment like she was 7. I thought about what I was going to have to tell her and how to tell it, and what it would do to her when I did. I thought, not yet. Not until you have everything. Not until there's nothing for him to argue with. Water doesn't rush. It pools. It waits. It finds the crack. I closed my eyes. I called an attorney on the morning of December 26th, not one I had used before. I had used an attorney once, for Patricia's estate, and he was a fine man but a generalist, which is not what this situation required. I called Jim Ballard's brother-in-law, whose name was Raymond Polk, who had spent 20 years as a federal prosecutor before moving to private practice, and who had the specific kind of directness that comes from long practice in rooms where being indirect wastes everyone's time. Raymond listened to me describe the situation for 12 minutes without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "I know someone. His name is David Park. He does financial fraud and property crime. He's not cheap and he's not fast, but he's right. Can I give him your number?" I said yes. David Park called me that afternoon. He had a voice that was younger than I'd expected. I had imagined someone closer to my age, experienced in that settled way that comes from decades of work. But he was probably 45, with a crisp and economical telephone manner that told me he had learned not to waste either his time or his clients. I described everything again. I told him about the wire transfer, about the easement application, about the LLC, about the timeline. I told him about Marcus's background and about the lunch where he had said property first. David was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Don't touch the wire transfer. Don't cancel it and don't call the bank yet. Don't do anything that lets him know you've seen it. Send me everything you have and I will make some calls." "How much time do I have before the transfer clears?" I said. "Wire transfers typically take 1 to 3 business days," he said. "But a transfer of this size to a new payee should trigger a fraud hold with most institutions. The question is whether your bank has already flagged it. I'll know more by tomorrow morning." "What are the odds?" "Honestly, it depends on the bank. But the fact that it's still showing as pending on December 26th, 2 business days after initiation, is a good sign. That suggests a hold may already be in place." I said thank you and sent him everything. He called me back the following morning, His voice had a different quality. Not excited, but settled in the way that a person settles when they have found something they were looking for. He said, "Your bank's fraud department flagged the transfer on the 23rd. It's frozen. They were going to reach out to you on the 26th, which is today, so they may be calling you shortly." I felt something release in my chest. Not relief, exactly. More like the specific sensation of a current that has been redirected, settling into its new channel. The $62,000 was still there. That problem was contained. "The property application is different," David said. "The county assessor has it under review, but it hasn't progressed to the point where anything has been transferred or conveyed. The representative's name, Arthur Finch. I've had a colleague look into it. The state bar has no record of Arthur Finch practicing in Tennessee, Georgia, or Alabama, which means either the credential is forged or borrowed. Either way, that application isn't going anywhere under its own momentum. But it exists, and your name is on it, and the LLC it's tied to is real." "Tell me about the LLC," I said. "Three of them, actually. Nested. Watershed Holdings South is the top-level entity. Below it are two operating companies registered in Delaware and Wyoming, respectively. The beneficial ownership structure is designed to be opaque. It's the kind of layering that takes time and a forensic accountant to unravel." He paused. "I want to bring in Greta Walsh. She's the best I've worked with for this kind of structure. She'll find what's there." "Do it," I said. "I want to be direct with you, Walter," David said. "What you've described is not a small operation. If he's done this, a fraudulent easement application, credential access for a wire transfer, it's not a first attempt. People who do this have done it before. The sophistication suggests practice." "I found two other applications in neighboring counties," I said. "Same LLC." A pause. "Send those to me." "Already in your inbox," I said. Another pause, slightly longer. "You're quite thorough," he said. "I used to map watersheds," I said. "Same principle." I didn't tell Renee. Not yet. I know what that sounds like. I want to explain it, because I've thought about it enough to be able to explain it clearly. If I had called Renee on December 26th and told her what I knew, I would have been telling her something incomplete. I would have been telling her about a wire transfer and a property application and an LLC, all real, all serious, but without the full picture of what they meant, what they were connected to, or how far they extended. Incomplete information in a situation like this doesn't protect the person you love. It puts them in a position where they have to make decisions under uncertainty, where the other side has room to maneuver, where a good attorney can create doubt about what actually happened. I had seen this pattern play out in professional contexts. A preliminary finding, presented too early, that the other party was able to obscure or reframe before the full evidence was assembled. I also knew Marcus. I knew that his first response to a confrontation would be to perform, to be confused, to be wounded, to produce an explanation that was technically coherent enough to give Renee a reason to doubt what she was hearing. He had spent 18 months making himself the interpreter of reality in her life. If I came to her with a half-built case, he could dismantle it from the inside. I needed everything first. I needed the picture to be complete enough that there was nothing to reframe. So I kept my routines. I drove to Dennis's house on Sunday afternoons and watched football. Dennis makes excellent nachos and does not discuss things while there is a game on, which suited me perfectly well. Carol brought food on the Sundays she was there and asked about my health with a concern that was entirely genuine, which I appreciated. We talked about the weather and the county and the game. We did not talk about Marcus or wire transfers or LLCs, because there was nothing yet to say that wasn't better left unsaid. I walked the property every morning. This was not a new habit. I had been walking the creek line since Patricia died, because being outside and moving had proven to be a reliable way to think without spiraling, which is a distinction I had not fully understood before I needed it. In January, the creek runs low and clear, and the watershed is visible in a way it isn't in summer, when the vegetation closes in around it. I could see the lines of drainage, the places where the land shaped the water's path, the way every feature of the landscape had been, over centuries, both shaped by and shaping the water that moved through it. I thought about what Marcus had been building, tracing the channels. He had access to my home, through Renee, which meant access to my home Wi-Fi network, which meant, as Greta Walsh's preliminary report would later confirm, the opportunity to install a credential capture application on a device he brought into the house, which then collected my banking login information over time without my knowledge. He had access to my property records through public county databases, which are not difficult to research. He had access to Renee's knowledge of my finances, which I understood with a specific cold clarity was not information I had given her with the understanding that it would be shared, but which she had shared because she trusted him. He had waited 9 months from the formation of the LLC to the wire transfer. 9 months of patience, of building the structure, of establishing his relationships and his access, of testing the credentials he'd collected before moving any money. That was not impulsive. That was the long game of a man who had done this before and understood the value of time. It takes patience to build something like that. I will say that much for him. But I thought, during those morning walks, that patience is not the same as wisdom, and the distinction matters. A patient person builds something and waits. A wise person builds something that will still be standing after someone else has seen it. What Marcus had built was designed to be invisible for long enough that it would succeed. But once it was seen, once someone looked at it from the right angle, with the right tools, it was actually not that hard to read. The structure was there. The channels were there. The drainage pattern was there. You just had to know how to look. David Park called me in the second week of January with an update from Greta Walsh. She had spent 10 days on the LLC structure, she said, and what she had found was both more and less complicated than the surface suggested. Less complicated in the sense that the beneficial ownership, once you stripped away the layering, was relatively direct. The operating companies traced to a holding entity, which traced to a management agreement, which had a signatory on the operating account who was Marcus Caldwell. More complicated in the sense that this structure had been used not once or twice, but apparently 5 times across 3 states in the prior 2.5 years. 5 properties, 5 families, or at least 5 attempts. Not all of them had completed. How many people got hurt? I said. We're still confirming, David said. 2 transfers completed before the targets identified them. One of those has already been recovered through bank fraud mechanisms. The other is in litigation. 3 others, including yours, were caught either at the pending stage or at the application stage. How did the others catch it? One hired an attorney who happened to know the LLC name from a prior case, professional network. One got a call from a bank fraud department. The third, the one in litigation, found out the way you did. A family member saw something. I thought about Dennis, about Carol doing genealogy research, and almost not saying anything because she thought she'd made a mistake. What's the status with the DA? I said. 3 jurisdictions are interested, David said. Mine, Millhaven, is the furthest along because you came to me first and your documentation is thorough. I'll be honest with you. Without your documentation, the timeline, the records you pulled yourself, this would be a harder case to build quickly. I mapped watersheds for 30 years, I said. You don't draw a watershed map without understanding how to document a system. David Park laughed, which surprised me. He said, "I need to start asking clients what they did before they retired." There is a thing that happens when you are holding information that will change someone else's life, and you are holding it because the moment is not yet right. And that thing is this. You notice the details of ordinary life in a way that you cannot when you are not carrying something. You notice the texture of a phone call that might be the last phone call of its kind. You notice the particular quality of a daughter's laugh when she doesn't know anything is wrong. You notice the spaces between things. Renee called me twice in the 3 weeks after Christmas. Normal calls, the kind that are not about anything specific, just the maintenance of a relationship, the ongoing proof of care that people offer each other through small, routine contact. She told me about a project she was working on, expanding a county water quality monitoring program to rural communities, specifically tracking lead levels in older infrastructure. She was excited about it, in the way that she gets excited about work that she believes matters, which is a quality I recognize and find difficult to look at directly sometimes, because it was so entirely her mother's quality too. She told me Marcus was busy with a new deal. She said it in passing, not prominently. I said that was good to hear. She asked how I was. I said I was fine. She said I sounded tired. I said it was January in Millhaven County, which is its own argument. She laughed. "Dad." "I'm fine," I said. She said she would come for Sunday dinner the following week. I said I would make soup. She said only if it wasn't too much trouble, which it never is, and which she has been saying since she was 25, and which I find no less charming now than I did then. She came for Sunday dinner. She ate 2 bowls of soup. We talked about her project, and about the County Water Authority, and about a book she'd been reading about the history of municipal water systems in American cities, which led to a conversation about the 1900 Galveston hurricane that went on for 45 minutes, and which I thoroughly enjoyed. Marcus called at 8 o'clock. She answered, spoke briefly, said she'd call him back. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When she hung up, she set the phone down face up on the table, and I noticed this, though I said nothing. I noticed that she did not volunteer anything about the call, that she turned the conversation back to Galveston as though the interruption had not occurred, that when I asked, lightly, if everything was all right, she said, "Yes, of course," with a fraction of a second's delay that was not enough to mean anything definitive, but was enough to be noticed by a man who had spent 30 years reading the rate of change in water levels. I said nothing. I let it pass. But I kept it. David Park told me he was ready on the morning of January 21st. He had the bank fraud filing, which had been completed and acknowledged. He had the county assessor's investigation initiated formally on January 9th, naming the application as potentially fraudulent. He had Greta Walsh's complete forensic report, which ran to 47 pages and documented, with the precision of a person who does not use the word apparently unless she means it, the full structure of the LLC network and its beneficial ownership. He had a preliminary coordination agreement with the district attorney's offices in 2 adjacent counties. And he had the letter, addressed to Marcus Caldwell, informing him that the Millhaven County DA's office was conducting an inquiry into real property fraud and credential theft and requesting his cooperation. "A letter," I said, "not a warrant." "Not yet," David said. "A letter creates pressure and puts him in motion without giving him clear information about how much we know. It forces a response, and his response will tell us things." "He'll hire an attorney," I said. "Immediately," David agreed. "And his attorney will make contact and ask questions, and those questions will tell us what he's most worried about, which tells us where the remaining gaps are." He paused. "This is not how everyone would approach it. But I think in this specific situation, with the documentation we have and the other jurisdictions in play, it's the right sequence." I thought about it for a moment. Pressure at one point. Watch where the water comes through. One condition, I said. Tell me. I call Renee today, before anything is served. Yes, David said. Absolutely. That was going to be my next sentence. I called Renee at 2 in the afternoon and asked her to come over. I said I had some things I needed to show her, and that I wanted her to look at them before we talked, and that I would explain everything, and that she didn't need to worry, but that it was important. She arrived in 40 minutes. She came in through the back door, the way she always has. She was wearing the coat Patricia had given her the last Christmas before she got sick. A dark green wool coat that was too big in the shoulders, which Renee had kept anyway, which she has worn every winter since. She came into the kitchen and stood across the table from me and looked at the file I had placed on the surface, and then she looked at me and she said, very quietly, "Dad, what is this?" I looked at her for a moment. She was 36 years old. She had her mother's eyes, which are darker than mine, and her mother's quality of attention, which is the quality of a person who is already seeing several moves ahead. She already knew, I think, that this was about Marcus. I think she had known something was coming since the Sunday dinner 3 weeks before, maybe earlier. There are things we know before we let ourselves know them, and there are people who are capable of holding those two kinds of knowing in separate rooms in their mind. And Renee had always been that kind of person. "I'm going to ask you to read everything before we talk," I said. "Not because I don't want to hear what you think, because the whole picture matters, and I want you to have the whole picture before you have to decide anything." She nodded. She sat down. She opened the file. I made coffee. I put a cup near her, and she didn't touch it. I sat across from her with my own cup and waited. She read the way she has always read, completely, without skimming, turning each page only after she had finished the previous one. I could not see her face from this angle, only the top of her head and the movement of her hands. She turned pages with a steadiness that I recognized from when she was a child and working through something hard. A math problem, a difficult book, an argument she was trying to understand. That same quality of deliberate attention, the refusal to rush. She stopped at one point, about halfway through the file, at the forensic report, and set everything down and got up from the table and went to the sink and stood there with her back to me for 30 seconds. I did not say anything. She turned the tap on and off. Then she came back and sat down and kept reading. When she finished, she closed the file. She put both hands flat on the table, fingers spread. "The device," she said. She did not look up. "Yes," I said. "The tablet." She was quiet for a moment. "He uses it for site visits. He brings it in the car. He brought it here twice." She paused. "He was here in August with it. I was here. I was using your Wi-Fi." I waited. She looked up. Her face was doing several things at once, and she was managing all of them with the discipline of a person who has decided that falling apart is not currently useful. "The device connected to your network in August." "First connection was August 11th, I said. "The credential capture application ran from August through October. That's what Greta found in the connection logs." "And the wire," she said. "December 22nd. 4 months after the first connection," I said. "Long enough to have confirmed the credentials worked. Long enough to be certain of what he was moving." Renee sat with that. She looked at the table. I watched her jaw set in a way I recognized from Patricia. From moments when Patricia had decided something that she didn't need to announce, and then did the thing without any further discussion. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since Christmas dinner," I said. "Your Uncle Dennis. Carol found the property application. Dennis told me at the table." She looked up again, Sharp. You knew at the table. I didn't know everything yet, I said. But you knew something. I knew there was a pending wire and that the property application existed, I said. I didn't know the full structure. I didn't know the forensics. I didn't want to come to you with a partial picture. She looked at me for a long moment. Her expression was not angry exactly. It was something more like the expression of a person who has just been told that the ground they've been walking on was not entirely what it appeared to be, and who is in the process of recalibrating their understanding of their own feet. "Did you know what he was before this?" she said. "Or did you suspect?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I saw things," I said. "Nothing concrete. Nothing I could have brought to you without it sounding like a father who couldn't give his daughter away." I noticed how he talked. I noticed the lunch in October 2021 when he talked about the property. There was an order to how he said things. I stopped. "But no, I didn't know anything. I wouldn't have told you if I had, without proof." Renee looked at me. "Why not?" "Because without proof," I said, "he could have explained it. And you would have been deciding between his explanation and my instinct. And I didn't want to put you in that position." She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I heard the refrigerator cycle on and off, which was something Patricia used to count as a unit of meaningful silence. "One refrigerator cycle," she used to say, "is about how long you need before you say the next thing." "The property application," Renee said finally. "It used your name." "Yes." "He had enough of your identifying information to file something in your name with the county assessor?" "Routing numbers from my account records, which he could have gotten through the credential capture. Social Security number, possibly. There were documents in the house that year for the estate planning work your mother and I had started and that I hadn't finished. I'm less certain about the Social Security number. Greta has a theory." Renee nodded slowly. She picked up the coffee I had made, which was now cold, and drank some of it anyway. "The engagement," she said. I waited. "He proposed in a restaurant," she said. "In front of people. In front of my friends." She said this not as a complaint, but as the observation of a woman who was now seeing a sequence of events with a different kind of clarity than the one she'd had when she was inside it. "He suggested I add him to my emergency contacts. He helped me organize my phone contacts. We went through them together. He said it would make his own contacts easier to manage." She stopped. She set down the coffee. "He asked me once about the property. About what you plan to do with it eventually. I told him it was complicated because of the watershed designation. He said he understood complicated properties." "When was this?" I said. "October," she said. "October of last year." October. 2 months before the wire. 1 month after the credential capture began. Renee looked at me with an expression that contained, as far as I could see, 3 distinct things. Grief, which was the largest. Anger, which was focused and cold. And something I can only describe as a kind of terrible clarity, which is the look on a person's face when they have seen something true that they would rather not have seen, but are grateful that they saw. "He was never going to hurt me," she said. "Not as a defense of him, as an analysis." "No," I said. "You were the mechanism. You wouldn't have been the target until there was something to target." She sat with that for a long time. I let her. Eventually she said, "Dad, I need to make some calls." "I know," I said. "David Park will talk to you directly if you want him to. His number is in the file." She nodded. She stood. She picked up the file and held it under her arm with the careful steadiness of someone who is managing a lot of things at once. She put on her coat, the green wool coat, and she stood at the back door and she looked at me. "You knew at the table," she said again. You passed the cranberry sauce. The map wasn't complete, I said. She shook her head slightly. Not in disagreement. The way you shake your head when something is exactly what you would have expected, and you can't quite decide how you feel about that. You are so like her, she said. I didn't say anything to that. She left. I heard the Silverado's engine start. She'd borrowed the truck because her car was in the shop, and listened to it through the kitchen window until the sound of it faded down the road. Then I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that it left behind, which was a very specific kind of quiet. The kind that means something has changed, and you are sitting in the first moment after the change. And everything after this moment will be different from everything before it. Patricia's coffee cup was on the counter. I said, I know. Marcus was served with the county assessor's formal notice on a Tuesday in the third week of January. David Park told me he'd retained an attorney by Friday, a firm in Nashville with a background in financial litigation, which David said was both expected and informative. He's treating this as a financial matter, David said. He either doesn't know about the criminal statute angle, or he's trying to keep it in the civil lane as long as possible. Can he? I said. Not indefinitely, David said. Greta's report is complete and documented, and I had a call from the DA's contact this morning. They've identified a fourth property case in another state, not a county I was aware of. If that's confirmed, Marcus's attorney is going to have a much harder time positioning this as a misunderstanding. What do they need from me? Your continued cooperation, which you've been giving, and patience. I have patience, I said. He may have smiled. I couldn't tell over the phone. I've noticed that, he said. What followed, the weeks and months of legal process, I am not going to describe in detail, because the detail is not the point of the story, and because legal process, in my experience, is most accurately described as the movement of water through very complicated terrain. It goes where it goes, and you can influence the rate, but not the physics, and the outcome depends as much on the shape of the underlying ground as on anything you do. Marcus's attorney attempted, in the second week of February, to approach David about a settlement that would have involved a restitution payment and a civil disposition with no criminal admission. David relayed this to me. I said no. Marcus's attorney tried again in March with a revised offer. I said no again. The criminal charge was what it was, and it was not mine to settle. What I can tell you is what happened on the outside of the legal process. Renee called Marcus the day after she came to my house. I don't know exactly what she said. I know it was brief. I know she asked him to remove his belongings from her apartment, and that he did so within 2 days, and that there was no scene that I was made aware of. She told me afterward, over the phone. He was sorry. He was very convincingly sorry. She said this with a dryness that I recognized as her way of processing something painful without performing the processing. I said I was sorry too. She said she knew. She told me, in February, that she had been carrying something of her own, not what I had been carrying, but something adjacent. That in the months before Christmas there had been moments that hadn't added up, and that she had explained each one to herself, and that the explaining had felt right because she had wanted it to. That she had trusted him because trusting him was easier than the alternative, and that she understood, now, that the ease had been engineered. I listened. I said the word for what she was describing was not naivete. She said she knew that too. We sat on the phone together for a while after that, without talking about anything specific. She is resilient, my daughter. She is her mother's daughter in this, as in everything. Grief for her is not a collapse. It's a current she moves through, feeling it, but staying upright, finding the footing as she goes. She was in a different apartment by March. New city, different county, a position with a public health nonprofit that her project had led her to, and which was exactly the kind of work she had been moving toward for the prior 5 years, without quite having a path to it. She called me the day she got the offer, and I could hear the specific quality of happiness in her voice that comes from something that was supposed to happen, finally happening. I said I was proud of her. I meant it without complication. Sylvia Caldwell sent me a note in February, handwritten, brief. She said she was embarrassed and sorry, and that whatever I thought of her son, she wanted me to know that she had not known, and that she was cooperating with investigators. I believed her. I wrote back and said so. I kept her earring until I could mail it back to her, which I did in March, and she sent me a short thank you note that said, at the bottom, "You raised a remarkable daughter, whatever else happened." I thought about that note for several days. The plea was entered in August of that year. David Park called me from the courthouse. He gave me the numbers and the terms and the timeline. Marcus would enter a guilty plea to wire fraud and criminal property fraud in 2 of the 3 jurisdictions, with a cooperation agreement that produced a deferred sentence in the 3rd. The restitution covered all 5 property cases. The condition of the plea included a permanent bar from real estate practice in those states. I said, "Is that everything?" David said, "That's everything." I said, "Thank you for your work." He said, "Thank you for yours. Seriously, Walter, the documentation you had the night of December 26th, 2 days after this started, that's not something most people do. Most people spend the first 2 weeks processing it. You were already mapping it." "I've been mapping things for 30 years, I said. "I know," he said. "I think that might be what saved you." I thought about that. About the difference between what saves you and what you bring with you. About the ways that the skills of your life, built for one purpose, end up serving a purpose you never saw coming. "Maybe," I said. It is November as I write this, more than a year out from that Christmas dinner. The 11 acres are unchanged. They look the same from the kitchen window, the creek line visible through the bare trees, the watershed running toward the county system, the way it has been running since before anyone alive can remember. In the spring, I had a survey done and a formal conservation easement filed. A real one, made in cooperation with the county, which permanently designates the watershed section as protected land and eliminates the kind of commercial development application that Marcus had tried to file. David Park reviewed the documentation. Greta Walsh confirmed the structure. It is now, in the driest legal sense possible, untouchable. I had a new door lock system installed in October, not because I was afraid, but because it needed doing, and I had been putting it off. The Silverado has 214,000 miles on it. The crack in the passenger side mirror is still there. I have not replaced it, and probably will not, because I know how to see around it, and because there is something to be said for knowing the limits of your own equipment. Dennis and Carol came for Thanksgiving. Carol made a pie that was excellent and said so with complete comfort, which is a quality I admire. Dennis ate 2 pieces. We sat on the porch after dinner in coats, with coffee, and watched the light go off the trees, and said very little. And what we did say was not about any of this. I told him that Carol's finding the application had made the difference. He said Carol had thought she might have made an error. I said she had not made an error. He said he knew that now. We left it there. Renee comes home every few months when the project allows it. She stayed last weekend, and we made Patricia's soup and talked until 11 o'clock about things that were important and things that were not, which is the texture of a relationship that has weathered something and come out with its joints still sound. She is good. She is, and I say this not as a father's bias, but as an honest assessment of what I can see, becoming more herself. There is a quality she has now that was there before, but quieter. a certainty about her own perception that I think she had been gradually persuaded to doubt, and which has been, in the past year, reinstated. I walked the creek line this morning. The water was low, the way it gets in November, before the winter rains bring it up. From the right angle, at the east end of the property near the basin, you can see where the watershed feeds into the county system. A small, unremarkable junction, a narrowing where two channels become one. It looks like nothing from a distance. From close up, if you know what you're looking at, you can see the evidence of everything that passes through it. The water table, the seasonal variation, the decades of accumulated movement that have shaped the bed beneath. I stood there for a while. Marcus Caldwell looked at 11 acres of watershed land in Millhaven County and saw what he had been trained to see. An underprotected asset owned by a quiet old man who drove a truck that was past its useful life and didn't appear to pay close attention to things. He was wrong about the truck. He was wrong about the attention. He was wrong about the most important thing, which is this. He believed that a person who moves slowly is a person who is not moving at all. He had never understood the difference between patience and inaction, between a man who doesn't react and a man who is choosing the right moment to respond. I am not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches. I have no interest in the last word, and I am not, particularly, a man who needs anyone to understand what just happened. What I did because it needed doing, and because I knew how. That's the whole of it. He thought he was looking at a quiet old man. He was looking at the mouth of a river. He saw the surface. He never thought to check the depth. And rivers, unlike old men, have no urgency about being underestimated. They simply keep moving.